They don't say they're losing interest. They say 4 innocent words and suddenly you start shrinking. I'm just busy is rarely about time. On the surface, it sounds reasonable, mature, even responsible. Life gets hectic. People have work, stress, obligations. But in avoidant dynamics, this phrase carries a very different function. It's a soft deactivation phrase, a way to create distance without triggering conflict, guilt, or accountability. Instead of saying I'm pulling away, they say something that sounds harmless enough for you to accept and internalize. Avoidants use this line most often when intimacy is increasing, when conversations are getting deeper, when consistency is expected, when emotional presence starts to feel required instead of optional. Their nervous system reads closeness as pressure, not connection. And rather than confront that fear directly, they unconsciously reach for a phrase that buys them space while keeping you emotionally available. They're not overwhelmed with life. They're overwhelmed with closeness. This is where the subtle damage happens, not through cruelty, but through confusion. Because when they say, I'm just busy, you don't hear rejection, you hear circumstances. And because you care, you adapt. You become more patient, more understanding. You tell yourself, this isn't about me. I just need to be flexible. And slowly, without realizing it, you start shrinking. You wait longer between messages. You lower your expectations. You hesitate before reaching out. You pre-edit your needs so you don't add pressure. This phrase quietly positions you into a role where you are waiting without clarity, understanding without reassurance, and emotionally available without commitment. And that's the function of the phrase, not to end the connection, but to pause responsibility while keeping access. They get the relief of distance without the discomfort of losing you. You carry the emotional labor of patience while they regulate themselves through withdrawal. What makes this especially disorienting is that avoidants often don't say this with malice. To them, it feels true. Their system really does feel overloaded. But the impact on you is the same either way, because the moment you accept busy as an ongoing explanation, you're no longer relating as an equal. You're adapting around their absence. And here's the key insight most people miss. Avoidants expect this adaptation. They expect you to wait. They expect you to remain available. They expect orbiting, not withdrawal. That's why arguing doesn't work. Explaining doesn't work. Offering flexibility doesn't work. Those responses only confirm the dynamic they unconsciously rely on, that when they pull back, you'll move closer emotionally to compensate. So what do you do instead? You don't argue. You don't explain. You don't negotiate access to yourself. You respond by reducing emotional access, not by demanding clarity. This is not coldness. This is not punishment. This is self-regulation. You stay warm but unavailable. Your tone remains calm. Your energy remains grounded. But you stop over-investing where presence is inconsistent. You stop filling in the gaps with understanding. You stop making their distance comfortable. That means fewer check-ins, less emotional labor, no chasing for reassurance, not as a tactic, but as a reflection of your standards. Because the moment you stop orbiting their schedule, something shifts inside them. The unspoken control they had, the certainty that you would remain emotionally on standby disappears. And that absence creates discomfort they can't ignore. Avoidants are most unsettled, not when they're confronted, but when they realize you're no longer organizing yourself around their availability. They start to feel the loss, not because you said anything dramatic, but because you didn't. Because you didn't fill the silence. You didn't compensate. You didn't wait in place. And that's the paradox. The more calmly you reclaim your emotional space, the more clearly they feel yours missing. I'm just busy only works on people who abandon themselves in response. The moment you don't, the phrase loses its power. Not because you demanded more, but because you quietly stopped offering yourself where presence was optional. And that's where the real shift begins. The sentence sounds open-minded, but it's actually an escape hatch. Let's see where this goes. It's one of the most misleading phrases in avoidant dynamics because it sounds flexible, mature, even emotionally intelligent. It gives the impression of curiosity instead of fear. It suggests possibility instead of avoidance. But underneath the tone, this phrase serves a very specific purpose. It keeps the connection undefined, so the avoidant never has to fully step forward. What it really means is simple, even if it doesn't feel that way in the moment. I want your energy without the responsibility of choosing you. This sentence allows them to stay close enough to receive warmth, validation, and emotional supply while remaining far enough away to avoid vulnerability. There is no risk in seeing where things go. There is no commitment in curiosity. And for an avoidant nervous system, that ambiguity feels safe. Avoidants use this phrase to delay definition. Definition requires presence. It requires consistency. It requires them to locate themselves emotionally and be seen there. By keeping things vague, they don't have to confront whether they're capable of showing up in the way closeness demands. They also use it to avoid vulnerability. Choosing someone is not just about labels, it's about exposure. It means admitting desire, attachment, and the possibility of loss. Let's see where this goes. Keeps their heart protected behind uncertainty. And finally, it allows them to keep options open, not always with other people, but with escape, with emotional exits, with the ability to pull back at any moment without explanation because nothing was ever defined. The most dangerous part of this phrase isn't what it says, it's what it does to you, because it creates false hope. You don't hear it as refusal, you hear it as not yet. You interpret it as patience being rewarded eventually. And so you invest, you show up emotionally, you deepen the connection. You share more, care more, adapt more, all while waiting for clarity that never quite arrives. This is how emotional imbalance forms. One person is seeing while the other is slowly committing. One person stays curious while the other becomes attached. And because nothing was explicitly promised, you end up questioning your own needs instead of the structure of the dynamic. This is where many people make the mistake of pushing for labels. They ask for clarity. They ask where things are going. They ask for reassurance. But with avoidance, pressure doesn't create presence. It creates retreat. And even when they give a partial answer, it's often another version of ambiguity. So what do you do instead? You don't push for labels, you shift your standards inward. Instead of asking them to define the connection, you decide what you require in order to stay emotionally invested. You stop treating uncertainty as something to endure and start treating it as information. You move forward only where clarity already exists. That means you engage where actions are consistent, where interest is steady, where effort is visible without negotiation, and where direction is implied through behavior, not postponed through language. At the same time, you stop supplying emotional intimacy where direction is missing. You don't overshare. You don't over-nurture. You don't emotionally merge with someone who hasn't chosen the connection, not as punishment, but as alignment. Because emotional intimacy is not a free resource. It's a response to safety, presence, and reciprocity. When those things aren't there, intimacy becomes self-abandonment. And here's what truly unsettles an avoidant. Not confrontation, not ultimatum, but your quiet recalibration. When they realize you're no longer waiting to be chosen, something shifts. The dynamic they were comfortable in, where time was open-ended and access was guaranteed, starts to collapse. They feel the absence not because you said anything dramatic, but because the energy changed. They sense that you're no longer positioning yourself as potential. You're positioning yourself as selective. And for an avoidant, that's destabilizing. Because curiosity only feels safe when the other person is available indefinitely. The moment availability becomes conditional on clarity, the nervous system has to make a choice, step forward or lose access. That's the power of this shift. Let's see where this goes. Only works when you agree to wait without direction. The moment you stop organizing your heart around their indecision, the escape hatch closes. Not because you demanded certainty, but because you no longer offered yourself to uncertainty. And that's when the dynamic either deepens or ends. Either way, you win because you're no longer waiting to be chosen. When someone says this, they already know what they're about to do. I don't want to hurt you. Sounds compassionate, gentle, almost caring. But in avoidant dynamics, this sentence rarely functions as protection. It functions as preemptive absolution. It's said not to prevent pain, but to soften the speaker's guilt before they create it. By the time these words are spoken, a decision has already been made internally. Distance has already been considered. Withdrawal has already been rehearsed. This phrase isn't a warning, it's an emotional disclaimer. A way to feel less responsible for what comes next. What they're really doing is preparing you emotionally so they don't have to face your reaction later. If you get hurt, they can tell themselves they tried to be kind. If you protest, they can retreat behind the idea that they were honest. It creates a moral buffer between their actions and their accountability. Avoidants say this most often when guilt is present, but vulnerability feels impossible. They care enough to feel discomfort, but not enough or not safely enough to stay present through it. So instead of engaging honestly, they reach for a sentence that makes them feel like a good person while they disengage. This phrase usually appears at very specific moments when they feel guilt about pulling away, when they're planning emotional distance but don't want conflict, when they want out not necessarily from you, but from the intensity without having to fully explain themselves. And here's why this line is so destabilizing for the person on the receiving end. It subtly transfers emotional responsibility onto you. Once they say, I don't want to hurt you, you feel an unspoken pressure to reassure them, to minimize your feelings, to say, it's okay, I understand. You become the caretaker of their guilt while your own emotional reality gets pushed aside. That's the trap. Because the moment you say, I'll be fine, you've absolved them. You've told them they don't have to stay present, don't have to explain, don't have to repair. Your reassurance becomes their exit. This is why explaining doesn't help here. Comforting doesn't help. Being understanding doesn't help. It only teaches their nervous system that they can avoid discomfort and still be seen as kind. So what do you do instead? You don't reassure them. You don't say, I'll be fine. You don't rush to manage their emotions. You let the silence do the work. Silence is not passive here. It's not punishment. It's emotional truth without performance. It's the moment you stop cushioning the impact of their choices so they don't have to feel them. When you don't immediately soothe them, something unfamiliar happens. Their guilt doesn't disappear, it stays. And for avoidance, sitting with unbuffered emotion is deeply uncomfortable. They're used to distance relieving internal pressure, but now distance doesn't work the same way because you're no longer participating in the emotional cleanup. This doesn't mean you become cold or cruel. It means you become honest through restraint. You allow their words to land without rushing to make them feel better about them. You allow space for them to feel what they feel without interference. And in that space, two things can happen. Either they step forward, not with explanations, but with presence, because they can't escape the weight of what they're doing. Or they step away fully without dragging you through prolonged ambiguity. Both outcomes protect you. The moment you stop managing their guilt, the dynamic changes. They're forced to face themselves without your emotional labor cushioning the fall. And that's something avoidants rarely experience because so many people rush in to make it easier for them to leave. I don't want to hurt you only works as an escape when you respond by shrinking yourself, when you soften your truth to protect their image of themselves, when you prioritize their comfort over your clarity. But when you don't, when you let the silence stand, they feel the weight of their choice without insulation. And whether they come closer or pull away, one thing becomes clear. You are no longer the one carrying the emotional cost. You didn't argue. You didn't plead. You didn't reassure. You simply stopped doing the emotional labor for someone who had already decided to step. And that's not coldness. That's self-respect. Because the most powerful response to preemptive absolution is refusing to give it. And in that refusal, you reclaim your ground. This is the moment most people panic, but it's actually the moment power shifts. I need space is one of the most misunderstood phrases in avoidant dynamics. It's often heard as rejection, criticism, or a verdict on your worth. But in reality, this sentence is rarely about you being too much. It's about their nervous system being flooded. Emotional closeness activates threat, where others feel safety, and distance becomes their primary way of regulating. For avoidance, space is not a luxury, it's a coping mechanism. When feelings intensify, when attachment activates, when expectations begin to form, their system moves into self-protection, and self-protection looks like withdrawal. So no, I need space doesn't mean you asked for too much. It means closeness, crossed a threshold. They don't know how to hold. But here's the part that changes everything. When they ask for space, they expect you to wait. They expect emotional availability without presence. They expect the connection to remain intact while they regulate alone. They expect that when they come back, you'll still be there, unchanged, accessible, understanding. That expectation is the hidden contract most people unknowingly sign And that's why this moment feels so destabilizing, because the instinct is to chase clarity, to reassure, to stay close enough so you're not forgotten. Panic sets in not because you lack power, but because you're afraid of losing the bond. But this is exactly where power shifts. If you respond differently, you don't chase, you don't protest, you don't pause your life. Chasing reinforces their belief that distance gives them control. Protesting frames closeness as pressure. Pausing your life communicates that your emotional state is dependent on their availability. Instead, you create real distance, emotionally and energetically. This doesn't mean disappearing dramatically. It means disengaging from the emotional waiting room. It means no constant checking, no emotional updates, no quiet hovering in the background of their life. You stop tracking when they'll come back and start reinvesting in your own rhythm. You don't announce this shift. You don't explain it, you embody it. Your energy moves forward instead of staying on hold. And this is where something unexpected happens inside the avoidant. They ask for space, expecting relief. And at first, they feel it. The pressure eases, the nervous system calms. But then they notice something else. Your presence is missing in a way they didn't anticipate. Because there's a difference between space with access and space without availability. They're used to space where the other person is still emotionally tethered, still thinking, still waiting, still reachable. But when you create genuine distance, that tether dissolves. And that's when space starts to feel like loss. Not because you did anything dramatic, but because you didn't stay in position. Avoidants don't feel absence immediately. They feel it after regulation, after the nervous system settles, after the noise quiets. And then the question arises, why does this feel different? It feels different because you didn't pause yourself. You didn't freeze in uncertainty. You didn't keep your heart open on standby. You didn't make it easy for them to return without consequence. And this is not punishment. This is alignment. Space is only healthy when it's mutual, when both people continue living, growing, and choosing themselves. But when space is one-sided, it becomes emotional control. And the only way to break that dynamic is to stop participating in it. When you create real distance, you reclaim your center. Your attention returns to your life. Your energy stops orbiting their absence. And paradoxically, that's what makes your presence felt more strongly than before. Because now, if they come back, they're not stepping into the same dynamic. They're stepping into a version of you who didn't wait. And if they don't come back, you didn't lose time waiting for someone who couldn't meet you. This is why I need space is not the end. It's the fork in the road. One path is panic, pursuit, and self-abandonment. The other is calm, withdrawal, self-respect, and growth. And the avoidant feels the difference between the two. Space without your presence is not soothing. It's confronting. It forces them to face the reality of separation instead of enjoying the comfort of distance with access. And that realization lingers far longer than any argument ever could. So when they say, I need space, remember this. You don't lose power here. You gain it. The moment you stop waiting and start living, and that's when space stops being a refuge and becomes the place where they finally feel what your absence actually means. Avoidants don't play people with cruelty. They play with ambiguity. Avoidants are often misunderstood as heartless or manipulative, but that's rarely the truth. What makes their behavior so confusing and so powerful is not cruelty, but ambiguity. They don't dominate through force. They don't control through threats. They create uncertainty, and uncertainty keeps people emotionally engaged far longer than clarity ever could. The words you've heard, I'm just busy, let's see where this goes, I don't want to hurt you, I need space, are not random. They are regulation tools. Each one reduces pressure on their nervous system while keeping the emotional connection intact. They allow closeness without commitment, distance without loss, and relief without resolution. And these phrases only work under very specific conditions. They work when you over-explain. Over-explaining is often framed as communication, but in these dynamics, it becomes self-erasure. You clarify your intentions, soften your needs, and translate your emotions so they don't feel overwhelmed. In doing so, you take responsibility for both sides of the emotional exchange. The avoidant doesn't have to lean in because you're already leaning enough for two people. They work when you self-abandon. Self-abandonment doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like patience, like understanding, like telling yourself to be low maintenance so the connection doesn't. You ignore your discomfort, dismiss your intuition, and override your own boundaries, all in the name of preserving something undefined. Ambiguity thrives where self-abandonment exists, and they work when you wait for potential instead of reality. Potential is intoxicating. It keeps you invested in what could be instead of what is. Avoidant phrases feed potential without delivering substance. You're not responding to the present. You're responding to a future that never quite arrives. And as long as you're waiting for potential, the present never has to change. This is why these words feel so powerful. They don't reject you outright. They don't end the connection. They keep the door open just enough for you to stay, and just closed enough for them to avoid stepping through. But here's the truth most people miss. The moment you stop reacting emotionally, the game ends. Not slowly, not eventually, immediately. Because ambiguity only works when someone is emotionally reactive to it. When you explain, wait, soothe, or hope, you're feeding the dynamic. But when you stop reacting, when you observe instead of absorb, the structure collapses. This doesn't require confrontation. It doesn't require ultimatums. It doesn't require speeches or closure. It requires outgrowing the position they needed you to stay in. That position was emotional availability without certainty, patience without reciprocity, presence without protection. You were never meant to live there. It was a holding pattern, not a partnership. When you step out of that role, something profound happens. The avoidant loses the buffer that ambiguity provided. Their words no longer land the same way. Their distance no longer feels neutral. Their silence no longer feels safe. Because now ambiguity costs them something. They can no longer rely on your emotional labor to stabilize their discomfort. They can no longer assume you'll stay open while they stay undecided. And that's when they're forced to face a choice they've been avoiding all along. Step forward into clarity or accept the loss that comes with distance. This is not about punishing them. It's not about making them regret anything. It's about reclaiming yourself. When you stop over-explaining, you return responsibility to where it belongs. When you stop self-abandoning, your nervous system stabilizes. When you stop waiting for potential, reality becomes your guide. And from that place, their words lose their power. And just busy becomes information, not an excuse. Let's see where this goes becomes directionless, not hopeful. I don't want to hurt you becomes a warning, not comfort. I need space becomes a boundary, not a threat. You don't harden. You don't close your heart. You simply stop negotiating with ambiguity. Avoidants don't play people with cruelty. They play with the spaces people are willing to sit in. And the moment you stand up from that space, calm, grounded, self-respecting, the dynamic ends. Either they rise to meet you or they fade into the distance. Both outcomes are clarity. Because the real power was never in understanding them more. It was in choosing yourself sooner. And once you do, the game doesn't just end, it becomes irrelevant because you're no longer available for connections that require you to disappear in order to stay.